On the 20th of August 1941, on a hot summer's day at a quiet rural crossroads south of Leningrad, a single Soviet heavy tank lay hidden in ambush. Watching that road was Senior Lieutenant Zinoviy Grigoriyevich Kolobanov. What followed would become one of the most famous tank actions of the Second World War. According to the official Soviet account, Kolobanov and his crew destroyed an entire German armoured column, surviving more than 150 direct hits in the process. A feat so extraordinary it elevated him to near mythical status. But did it really happen like that? In this video, using aerial imagery, battlefield reconstruction and archival records from both Soviet and German sources, we're going to break down that story piece by piece and reconstruct what most likely happened here on this road on that day. This is the true story of Kolobanov's ambush at Vuikovice. To understand the battle, we first need to take a closer look at the wider situation in August 1941. 2 months into Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was advancing at a staggering pace. Army Group North had swept through the Baltic states, decisively defeating Soviet forces in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, and was now driving towards Leningrad. By mid-August, German panzer divisions had broken through the so-called Stalin Line, a network of pre-war fortifications that had already been partially abandoned and was in many places incomplete, and were advancing on Krasnovardesk, modern-day Gachina. This was not just another town, it was a key road and rail junction controlling multiple approaches into Leningrad from the southwest. If it fell, German forces would have a relatively open route towards the city itself, and at that stage of the war it was a very real possibility. The problem for the Soviets was there was very little left to stop them. The Red Army in this sector had been shattered by weeks of retreat, and entire formations had ceased to exist as cohesive units. What remained were hastily assembled militia, NKVD cadets, and fragments of regular divisions, often short of heavy weapons, transport, and communications. In many cases, these forces were deployed simply to delay the German advance for as long as possible. But there was one important asset still available: a small number of heavy tanks. The KV1 was, in 1941, one of the most formidable tanks in the world. Designed in the late 1930s, it represented a completely different philosophy of armoured warfare compared to most German vehicles at the time. Its armour, up to 75mm thick on the front and even heavier in some areas of the turret, made it effectively immune to the standard German anti-tank weapons then in widespread use. The 37mm Pak 36, still common in many units, could do little more than leave dents at close range. Even the newer 50mm guns, both towed and tank-mounted, struggled unless firing at very close distances or from advantageous angles. The short-barreled 75mm guns of early Panzer IVs were designed primarily for infantry support and were similarly ineffective against heavy armour. In contrast, the KV1's 76mm gun could destroy any German tank then in service at typical combat ranges of even 1,000 meters or more. In simple terms, a KV1 in a well-prepared defensive position was extremely difficult to deal with. German units encountering these tanks in 1941 often had to resort to indirect methods, artillery, air support, or the famous 88mm anti-aircraft gun to deal with them. And on this road, one such tank was about to be put to the test. The KV1, often shown in photographs bearing the slogan "Pobieda będzie za nami," "Victory will be ours," is frequently misidentified as Kolobanov's. Of that actual vehicle, no image exists, but we do know who crewed it. At the gun was Senior Sergeant Andrei Yusov, an experienced gunner who will play a critical role in the engagement. Driving the tank, Senior Sergeant Nikolai Nikiforov. The loader, Private Pavel Kizilkov, and on the whole machine gun and radio, Senior Sergeant Nikolai Rodenkov. Each of these roles was essential. In a tank engagement, success depended not just on the vehicle, but on the coordination of the crew inside it. Target acquisition, range estimation, rate of fire, communication, all of these had to work together under intense pressure. And in command of them was Kolobanov himself. A 30-year-old veteran of the Winter War against Finland, he had already seen armoured combat under difficult conditions, including fighting in forested terrain and against well-prepared defensive positions. By August 1941, he was commanding a company of heavy tanks in the 1st Tank Division, deployed in the Leningrad sector. His orders were simple: stop the German advance. But actually doing so was anything but. Let's take a closer look at the ground. By overlaying wartime aerial photography onto the modern landscape, we can identify the likely site of the ambush. The key feature is this crossroads near the state farm of Wojkowice. Any German force advancing towards Gatchina from this direction would have to pass through it, and that makes it a natural choke point. Kolobanov positioned his KV1 just off the road in a concealed, hull-down position, likely about here. From this location, he could cover a stretch of road approximately 400 meters long. And that detail matters because it allows us to estimate how many vehicles could realistically have been caught in the ambush. It also tells us something about his intent. This was not a random defensive position, it was a carefully selected killing ground. Opposing him were elements of German panzer formations advancing ahead of their infantry support. These were not purely tank units, but combined arms formations known as Kampfgruppen. Typically, these would include a mix of Panzer III tanks, armoured half-tracks, such as the SD KFZ-251, motorised infantry and supporting anti-tank guns. Their objective was to move quickly, probe for weaknesses and push through Soviet defences before they could stabilise. And on the morning and early afternoon of August the 20th, one such column approached the crossroads at Wojkowice. The official Soviet version of events recalls around mid-afternoon, the first German vehicles appeared, motorcycle scouts, and they passed straight through the crossroads without spotting the tank. Kolobanov held his fire, waiting for the main column. Then, moments later, it arrived. Panzer III tanks followed by armoured vehicles and infantry. As the lead tank reached the crossroads, a single shot. The first tank was hit and disabled. For a moment, confusion. The Germans believed they'd struck a mine. Then, second tank destroyed. Now the situation was clear. They were under attack. Kolobanov immediately shifted fire to the rear of the column. The last vehicles were knocked out, trapping the entire formation on the road. Unable to advance and unable to retreat, this was a classic ambush technique. Fix the enemy in place and then destroy them methodically. What followed, according to Soviet accounts, was a prolonged engagement lasting close to an hour. German tanks opened fire from all directions and shell after shell struck the KV1. Inside, the crew were battered by the impacts, as Sergeant Usov recalled. The incessant firing made the barrel become so hot that the paint completely peeled off. Smoke was accumulating inside the tank, making it hard to breathe, and with each hit, bulges were forming on the inside, and tiny splinters were breaking off and being flung into our face and into our hands. Although enemy shells did not penetrate the armour of our KV, they made such a roar that it seemed as if they were hitting us on the head with a sledgehammer. But the armour held. One by one, German vehicles were destroyed. Some attempted to manoeuvre off the road, others brought up anti-tank guns, likely 50mm PaK-38s. Kolobanov's crew engaged them in turn. Here's Usov again. At that moment, I saw the enemy at the crossroads deploying 2 anti-tank pieces. I took aim, counting every second. I fired off a high-explosive shell, and with the first shot I blew up one of them. But the other one then fired and hit us in return, knocking off the commander's periscope. I didn't allow it to fire the next shot. At one point, a hit jammed the turret, forcing the driver to rotate the entire tank to aim the gun. This was an improvised solution, but an effective one. After nearly an hour of fighting, the surviving Germans withdrew, leaving the battlefield littered with wrecked vehicles. The official Soviet tally, 22 tanks destroyed by Kolobanov alone, 43 vehicles destroyed by his unit in total, 156 hits absorbed by his tank. It is an extraordinary story. But how much of it stands up to scrutiny? Let us take a look, because as with many accounts from the Eastern Front, the details are far from straightforward. Both sides had reason to distort what happened. Soviet reports often inflated success, particularly when documenting acts of heroism. German reports, on the other hand, operated under a very different system. A vehicle was only counted as lost if it was a total write-off, destroyed beyond repair. Damaged vehicles, even heavily damaged ones, might be recovered, repaired and returned to service, and crucially those losses might only be recorded days or even weeks later, if at all. So the immediate reports on both sides can give a very misleading picture. Official Soviet reports from the battle cite 38 enemy tanks destroyed overall. Of these, 22 are attributed to Kolobanov. That number though, 22, is interesting because it corresponds almost exactly to the size of a standard German panzer company. Which raises the question, was this an accurate count or a convenient one? At the same time, German records for the same period report minimal losses in the immediate aftermath, which on the face of it contradicts the Soviet version entirely. But again, that does not necessarily mean no losses occurred. It may simply mean they were recorded differently or later or spread across multiple reports. By returning to the terrain, we can test what's physically possible. From Kolobanov's position, only a limited section of road is visible, roughly 400 meters. Given typical vehicle spacing, allowing for movement and reaction time, that would place perhaps 30 to 35 vehicles within that kill zone at any one time. So the scale of engagement described is, at least in principle, plausible. But some details are more difficult to reconcile. Soviet accounts describe multiple tanks becoming stuck in swampy ground, yet aerial imagery shows that this area was largely open farmland with only one small pond nearby. That suggests only a handful of vehicles, not an entire column, could have been immobilized in that way. It also raises another possibility, that Kolobanov was not acting alone. Other KV1 tanks from his company were deployed to cover nearby approaches. If they were engaged at the same time, then the destruction attributed to a single tank may in fact have been the result of a wider defensive action, which would explain both the higher total losses and the difficulty in attributing them precisely. So what actually happened? When we combine all of the available evidence, a more balanced picture begins to emerge. There almost certainly was an ambush at this crossroads. Kolobanov's KV1 did engage German forces at close range, and it likely did destroy a significant number of vehicles. But the idea that a single tank, acting entirely alone, destroyed an entire enemy column of 22 tanks is far less certain. What seems more likely is that Kolobanov's action formed part of a larger defensive engagement involving multiple Soviet tanks and units. An engagement which was later simplified and amplified into a single dramatic narrative. It's also almost certain that some of the tanks destroyed here were likely German half-tracks, possibly mounting an anti-tank gun, but not proper tanks. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the exact details, Kolobanov's action remains one of the most famous tank engagements of the war. Kolobanov himself fought on until September 1941, when he was gravely wounded by shrapnel which punctured his spine, and he spent much of the remainder of the war in various hospitals, returning to service in July 1945, shortly after the war in Europe had ended. And although he was nominated for the highest Soviet award for his actions at the crossroads, the Hero of the Soviet Union, it was never granted, he receiving the lesser award of the Order of Lenin in its place. Even so, his reputation endured, and today, at the site of that ambush, a Soviet heavy tank stands as a memorial to the battle. A reminder not just of what happened here, but of how difficult it can be, even decades later, to separate history from legend. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then we think you'll love our brand new book, Inferno. Written with the same principles we use right here in our videos. Investigation, deep dives, and detail focused. It covers 12 key battles from both world wars that shaped the course of the 20th century. Pre-orders for print, ebook, and audiobook versions are available right now at the link below, and every purchase helps us to keep making content just like this. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.